On this Wednesday night, keeping a promise. The UK calls Canada's pledge to resettle 20,000 Afghans aspirational. So what is the timeline, and how many is Canada really rescuing from the Taliban?
We cannot accommodate 20,000 people all in one go. I spoke to the Canadians last night, Kay, and they can't.
Plus, the Afghans already here fear time is running out for their loved ones.
Right now, we are just trying to save their lives.
The Major General who ran Canada's vaccine rollout charged with sexual assault.
This arrest warrant was a total surprise.
Plus, to boost or not to boost, Ontario's plan for a third dose. Is it the right thing to do when much of the world still waits for a first dose? And a Tory majority, what a progressive Conservative win in Nova Scotia may mean for the federal race.
Global National with Dany Fortin.
On the road to the airport in Kabul, a crush of people still live in hope, enduring Taliban warning shots to clear the road. These people have heard the promises from the West and know the airport is their only lifeline to a Taliban-free future. Good evening and thanks for joining us. The U.S. military says it now has taken control of Kabul airport and secured both the civilian and military sides. Flights are operating. The U.S. says it has airlifted out about 2,000 people in the last 24 hours. India, the U.K. and Holland also got people out, though there are reports some flights are leaving with many empty seats. The Taliban control everything else in the city. It has set up checkpoints across the capital and near the airport, reportedly beating and intimidating some Afghans, though the Taliban is escorting some convoys of foreign evacuees to the airport, including citizens from the U.S. and India. Redmond Shannon has tonight's top story on the race to escape and the emerging signs of resistance to Taliban rule.
A Taliban flag on a US-made Humvee outside the British Embassy. There is no doubt about who is in control now. Taliban leaders sit down with the man who led the country until 2014, Hamid Karzai, as the group looks to form a government.
The system of the government is clear. That is an Islamic government. Sharia law would be, of course, there would be no democratic system at all.
In Kandahar, once the base of Canadian forces in the country, Taliban members celebrate the return of co-founder Mullah Baradar from his exile in Qatar. Speaking from exile in the United Arab Emirates, outgoing President Ashraf Ghani says he fled to avoid being lynched. But his Vice President Amrullah Saleh insists he is the new rightful leader, asking Afghans to join the resistance against what he calls Taliban terrorists. An anti-Taliban march in the city of Jalalabad was met with gunfire. At least 3 people were killed. Reports across the country say Taliban members have been knocking on doors, checking people's identities. The UK, like Canada, has promised to accept around 20,000 Afghan refugees. Britain's Interior Minister gave the first indication of details of Canada's resettlement timeline.
We cannot accommodate 20,000 people all in one go. We have to have this. Well, actually, I spoke to the Canadians last night, Kay, and they can't.
On Tuesday, MPs packed the British House of Commons for the first time in the pandemic. Prime Minister Boris Johnson facing scathing words even from his own MPs during an emergency sitting of Parliament.
Well, where is our foreign policy determined? Here or in Washington?
I do find it incomprehensible and worrying that the United Kingdom was not able to bring together not a military solution, but an alternative alliance of countries.
This is a shame on all of us, not just America, but also the whole of NATO.
The Prime Minister told MPs that the Taliban would be judged on their actions and not their words. But Johnson didn't outline what the consequences of that judgment would be. Redmond Shannon, Global News, London.
What about that promise by Canada to resettle more than 20,000 Afghans? Is it aspirational, as Britain's Home Secretary revealed, and will it include the people who fear they are in imminent danger from the Taliban, including interpreters and other contractors who worked for Canada? Mercedes Stephenson is traveling with the Prime Minister, who is campaigning in Vancouver. Mercedes, did he offer any clarity on this?
Well, Donna, we asked the Prime Minister and we didn't really get a clear answer, despite the fact he keeps talking about that 20,000 number. So I spent today digging into this to find out what's what. Here's the deal. The 20,000 number are not new positions that are being created for Afghans. They're within existing quotas. So kind of like how you would make reservations in a dining room for a certain table, this will reserve 20,000 of Canada's existing spots for refugees from Afghanistan. But it doesn't add new spots on top of that. And it's for people who have already fled the country or those who are able to get out. It will not be a rescue mission to bring out people who are on the ground. Canada will also accept those interpreters and those who worked closely for Canada. That will be on top of the 20,000. And those are the folks who are going to be going and actually rescuing from Kandahar airfield. But unlike the Americans, it won't be a situation where anyone who wants to get on one of our planes to come as a refugee can. Now, one of the big questions is how do you even get out of the country or get to the airport? There's been a lot of criticism of the government on this because they haven't provided much information or have provided very complex documents. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say about that today.
The limiting factor on this is not paperwork or not connections with the Canadian government. The limiting factor on getting people out of Afghanistan right now is people being unable to get to the airport, people being unable to actually leave the country.
Immigration lawyers who we spoke to, though, say there's no hotline, there doesn't appear to be a clear application process, and it's becoming very confusing for those who are on the ground in Afghanistan and those here in Canada who are hoping to bring family members to join them.
Okay, and Mercedes, I want to ask you about the news that broke today. Major General Dany Fortin, who was leading logistics for Canada's COVID-19 vaccine rollout, has been charged with 1 count of sexual assault. He appeared at a Gatineau, Quebec courthouse today.
This arrest warrant was a total surprise. I am reluctantly and at my own expense forced to pursue 2 forms of legal redress. The first, to vigorously defend myself against the charge laid today in criminal court. And second, to ask the federal court to consider the lack of due process accorded me throughout this ordeal.
Mercedes, he says this is political. What are the other layers to this story?
Well, there's the whole issue of sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, but Major General Fortin is saying that this was essentially a decision of political expediency and that the government threw him under the bus without giving him the facts. Mr. Trudeau was asked about that today. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say.
I'm not going to make any comments on that because obviously it is an ongoing court situation, but I will repeat how incredibly important it is that everyone who serves in the Canadian Armed Forces has an environment that is safe and supportive.
The Prime Minister reiterated the government's commitment to fighting sexual misconduct in the military, but did not answer a question about why the government is not forcing the military to hand sexual assault and sexual misconduct files over to civilian authorities. This will be an issue the Liberals will continue to have to deal with on the campaign trail, as one of their former top generals and one of their current top generals will be in court during the election on criminal charges. Donna?
Okay, Mercedes Stephenson in Vancouver, thanks. Elections Canada has laid out plans for how Canadians will vote and get results in the federal election. The chief electoral officer says there will not be a final outcome on September 20th, election day, because of the amount of mail-in ballots that are expected. Stéphane Perreault says counting mail-in ballots won't start until after election day.
In most locations, this should be done within 2 days, but in some districts, it could take as long as 5 days, depending on the volume and the distribution.
Elections Canada says up to 5 million Canadians are expected to vote by mail. About 50,000 cast mail-in ballots in 2019. Perreault says the election will be safe, even though polling officers are not required to be vaccinated. Voters will be asked to follow provincial rules for masking, and plexiglass dividers will be in place. To vote by mail, you must apply through Elections Canada by September 14th, and you will not be able to change your mind and then cast your vote in person. Turning now to the campaign trail, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh spent the day in Metro Vancouver, a region struggling with skyrocketing housing prices. Singh says an NDP government would build 500,000 affordable homes in 10 years. And he's vowing to bring in a one-time 20% foreign homebuyers tax.
We want to make it So it is not at all a viable option for big money from foreign countries to invest in the Canadian housing market. We want the Canadian housing market to be for Canadians who need a home. It should not be for big business.
The Conservatives make a point of highlighting the Liberals' ethical issues, and today, Erin O'Toole unveiled his plan for accountability. It includes bigger fines and a block on MPs accepting speaking fees. But a different question of accountability has been dogging his own campaign: how he will handle unvaccinated candidates. Abigail Bimman is on the Conservative campaign in Quebec City. Abigail?
Donna, Conservatives keep stressing they want to campaign safely during COVID. So far, no public events, and most either virtual or in empty hotel rooms. So it didn't quite add up that Erin O'Toole wouldn't answer questions around whether his own candidates out campaigning are vaccinated. The other parties tackled that issue right out of the gates. Wednesday, he was finally clear they have a choice.
I expect my team to follow all the public health measures in this Justin Trudeau fourth wave pandemic. That includes expectations with respect to vaccines or an expectation to daily rapid testing.
That's the same position O'Toole is advocating when it comes to mandatory vaccinations in general. He says Canadians should have a reasonable alternative. Justin Trudeau Wednesday doubled down on the Liberal position that no one will be able to board a train or plane who is unvaccinated unless and only unless they have a medical exemption. As for Conservative candidates and anyone campaigning, the party sent out this edict Tuesday morning to all candidates, making the position clear: get the shot or take a daily rapid test. It includes links for where local campaigns can order tests. Noticeably absent from that directive was any follow-up mechanism. The party couldn't say how or even if this so-called expectation would be enforced, and doing so would certainly be a tall order. Donna?
All right, Abigail Bimman on the Conservative campaign. Thanks. A lot of people are trying to read the tea leaves after what happened in the Nova Scotia election last night. The Progressive Conservatives won a majority, defeating the Liberals, a surprise to many who thought another pandemic election would be won by the incumbents. What, if anything, does it signal about the federal election? Ross Lord is looking into that.
There's nothing quite like a triumph that's unexpected. Nova Scotians are placing their faith in the Progressive Conservatives Premier-designate Tim Houston. The 51-year-old accountant sold them on an ambitious agenda full of healthcare spending promises and inclusivity.
No matter the color of your skin, your gender, who you love, how you pray, or the language you speak, our PC government will listen to you, will respect you.
Polling suggested a close outcome, but the Tories ended up with a majority of Nova Scotia's 55 seats.
Well, I didn't really see us going PC at all.
But fingers crossed for the future, because this is a great city to live in and a great province to live in.
Incumbent Premier Ian Rankin was blasted for worsening ambulance service and failing to fix waiting lists for doctors. Rankin was also haunted by his handling of 2 impaired driving incidents from years ago and by the forced resignation of a candidate who posted boudoir photos online. In defeat, Rankin tried to focus on positives, like the government's success against COVID-19.
We are leaders in this pandemic. We will be leaders in the recovery, no matter who's in government.
Political analysts say Nova Scotia results should not automatically be applied to the federal campaign, but they say there are lessons to be learned for Justin Trudeau's Liberals.
In some ways, we are past the phase, the period of time where COVID elections were producing the benefit of the doubt for incumbents.
Regional success for Conservatives might or might not help the federal Conservatives, because Houston has distanced himself from Erin O'Toole's party, both in language and in policy. Ross Lord, Global News, Halifax.
The debate over a third dose coming up. The U.S. plans to offer all adults a third COVID-19 shot. Is it the right thing to do? And will Canada do the same? Just hours after Ontario announced it will become the first Canadian province to offer COVID-19 booster shots to vulnerable people, the U.S. is following suit. It says all American adults over the age of 18 will be offered a third dose. Jamie Maracher explains why and whether Canadian public health experts think it's the right thing to do.
Heart transplant recipient Mike Willis is one of few Canadians who have had 3 COVID-19 vaccines.
I had 0 antibodies from the first 2 shots of Moderna.
Part of a Toronto-based trial, it wasn't until his booster shot the 66-year-old had any protection at all.
With the Delta variant circulating, we need to make sure that everybody's antibodies are at the level that they should be.
And partly why U.S. health officials have decided to recommend third doses of Pfizer and Moderna to all Americans 18 or older 8 months after their second shot.
You want to stay ahead of the virus.
The U.S. Centers for Disease Control say recent data from the U.S. and Israel reveals immunity to COVID-19 for the general population decreases around 6 months after a second shot.
This happens with all vaccines or even infections. Understanding the nuances of what waning immunity means and correlates of protection really are going to take some time.
The studies also found a third mRNA vaccine can boost COVID-19 antibody levels tenfold, which Dr. Anthony Fauci called a dramatic increase. Still, Canadian health experts aren't convinced prioritizing boosters domestically is the best way to fight COVID-19 globally.
We are not dealing with the core of the problem. And the core of the problem is that this virus is out there all over the planet Earth.
The World Health Organization has asked countries like Canada to hold off on third doses until at least the end of September. Canada's National Advisory Committee on Immunization has not proposed boosters for the general population, but it says it is reviewing data and will be updating its recommendation in the coming weeks. Donna?
All right, Jamie Morocker in Toronto, thanks. Record inflation in Canada still ahead. What's causing it? Canada's inflation rate surged in July to its highest level since 2011. Gas prices jumped 30% over the last year. Housing costs went up nearly 14%, and restaurant expenses rose more than 3%. Anne Gaviola reports on what is triggering the inflation and what it could lead to.
More. If it feels like just about everything in your life costs more right now, you're right. It does. Cost increases are being driven by rising gas prices and supply chain issues. Canada's inflation rate surged to 3.7% in July, levels we haven't seen in a decade. The pace of inflation has been above 3% for 4 straight months. And if you think your grocery bill is giving you sticker shock now, experts say there's more food inflation to come.
Things are dire out west. The drought and sort of these extreme weather conditions that arise due to climate change will continue to wreak havoc on food prices.
This Toronto restaurant owner says rising meat, protein, and fresh produce costs are hitting her bottom line.
We don't want to raise our prices right now, too. We understand that we are all in the middle of a pandemic, but that's something that we might have to be doing later on, looking into fall and winter.
Who best addresses food inflation and supports small businesses will decide her vote next month.
Well, I want to see if they have a recovery plan. How do we keep our doors open? Prices are going up, hydro's gone up.
When we ask about affordability, the NDP tends to do better than any other party on that issue. So if affordability is the number one issue in this election campaign, it's a good opportunity for Jagmeet Singh and the NDP.
Ipsos polling shows that affordability, including food inflation, ranks among Canadians' top election issues, particularly among millennial and Gen Z voters, who now make up 40% of the population and were instrumental in getting Justin Trudeau elected in the past. Anne Gaviola, Global News, Toronto.
Safe in Canada, but desperate to save loved ones back home in Afghanistan. That's next. The Taliban's leaders claim they don't want to turn Afghanistan into a battlefield again and won't impose the same brutal rule and repression of 2 decades ago. It is hard to have faith in that, though, especially for many Afghan refugees here in Canada who still have family back home. Mike Drolet has been talking to some of them.
From a world away, the streets of Kabul, while quiet, seem peaceful. The Taliban promised tolerance, but that barely lasted a day. Some female journalists have now been banned from appearing on TV, leaving Afghans to wonder what measures may be next. Mina, a healthcare worker whose identity we agreed to conceal, was forced to flee Canada after speaking out against Taliban atrocities in 2019.
They killed mothers, they killed pregnant women, they killed healthcare providers, they killed newborns, innocent children.
She was declared a protected person by Canada's Immigration Board, but the process to reunite with her husband and 3 children who remain in Afghanistan has been slow and cumbersome.
Right now we are just trying to save their lives. We don't think about their future. We don't think about their education right now. They should be safe. We should have them alive.
The federal government says it plans on opening the doors to 20,000 Afghans. The Canadian Council for Refugees says Canada should have stepped up years ago.
And it is heartbreaking to think that if Canada had acted responsibly in the past few years, most of these people would be safely here in Canada.
Mohammed, whose identity we're also concealing, developed close ties to Canada while working in the Afghan Ministry of Finance. That made him a target. He fled in 2019, leaving behind his wife and 10 kids, 6 of them girls over the age of 15. They're educated, he says, with dreams of becoming doctors and business leaders. They're now in hiding and fear being married off to Taliban fighters, or worse.
They call it Canadas, you know?
Canadas.
Yeah, that means that you take the woman and whatever you want, you can use for.
Doesn't sound like she has any rights.
No rights.
Mina, he's desperate for his adopted country to step up. His family's lives are at stake. Mike Drolite, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Donna Friesen. It is a deeply uncertain time, especially for women and girls in Afghanistan. And yet this group of women and some young men won't be silenced. Their message to the world: Afghan women are stronger than they were 20 years ago when the Taliban last controlled Afghanistan. They say we will not give up our right to work, education, and political rights, and we will not give up. Thanks for watching. Take care of yourselves. Bye-bye.